It's rather odd that so there's very little known about the shooter. He basically exists in a 2022 BlackRock commercial, and like there's very little on him, like no manifesto. I mean, if you think about some of the big name or the mass shooters or shootings that got like bigger attention in recent years, there's a lot more on them, either scrubbed from the internet or their social media posts or all sorts of things. Seems like this one's kind of I don't know, not a lot of info on him, which is kind of interesting. But again, a lot of people are more focused on that than perhaps his VP pick or any of the other things that he's come out and said since that, such as his willingness to consider putting Jamie Dimon in charge of the Treasury Department, things like that. So, I honestly don't know exactly what happened there, and I haven't, again, looked at it too closely, and I don't want to get in trouble by commenting on things that I haven't studied. But generally, when these things happen, regardless of whether it was organic or not, the responses, especially people's emotional responses, are always manipulated by the powers that be. I think that's something people should perhaps keep in mind because, the federal government, intelligence agencies, and also, in the private sector, it's pretty well known that people tend to make decisions based on how they feel rather than, what rather than critical thought or rational thought. So, when people are very emotional and very emotionally wound up, they tend to try and move people more than perhaps they would otherwise. And I guess that's all I really have to say about it. I don't know if Marty wants to add anything.
Well, totally. Well, I think it's, it's interesting. I think everything that you kind of just said is totally spot on. It's interesting that like the main guy that's kind of come out and been like false flag was like Reid Hoffman, who was like a huge part of this piece that we just dropped, honestly, huge part of it. But, he's kind of a social network, like data baron. Founded LinkedIn, but, is super important in PayPal, and he's on the Microsoft board, and he's really heavily connected with this Endeavor Group. But I think it's really interesting when you look at, kind of what Whitney just said, like this idea that, they're basically trying to manufacture consent and simulate reaction using social networks as sort of the main, way that we intake information. And these social networks are all run by, this kind of, data broker, social network cabal, basically, this like Facebook group that, Whitney's written a lot about coming out of, DARPA and kind of military origins of social networks. And, they now have it so dialed in now that they can basically use these networks and use, stimulus, to very specifically direct it at certain bands of demographics. And they can basically kind of simulate and stimulate a reaction of very specific groups. They can look at far right groups. They can look at, people with interest in anti-government, ideals. They can look at people that just totally line up to, eat up the slop of the CNN narrative or whatever. And they can kind of exactly pick these people and feed them very specific data points. Using these network tools that are just really great for, taking data, scraping data, but also their data distribution networks as well. And so now we're seeing, this just totally hyper real, they're going to do whatever they want to do. We're going to go wherever they want us to go anyway. A lot of this election stuff every 4 years, people just forget. They're pushing us wherever they want to go, and they use social networks and they use this sort of data distribution, to manufacture consent for where it's going. And I think that's kind of just where we're at with this. I haven't really looked too much into it. I've been trying to stay off. So these social networks. There's
a lot of other work to be done in this line of work, I guess. Plenty of other people are covering, the weekend's events. And on to sort of piggyback on what Mark was saying.
Hey, you, do you still have your Bitcoin on an exchange? Don't hold your Bitcoin on an exchange. Take it into self-custody. If you're looking for an easy way to do that, we have the BitKey. BitKey is Bitcoin made easy to use and hard to lose. Take the first step, get your Bitcoin off the exchange. Check out the link in the show notes. That'll get you 20% off. your BitKey or use the code TFTC20 at checkout.
You know, one of the big efforts of the people sort of guiding AI policy in the United States, they've talked about how AI will be leading us into divergent realities based on what information is shown to people, what the algorithm's shown to people. And so, like, you know, if you look at the events over the weekend, a lot of people, like, on the left, right, where it was being said more over there that this was like a staged thing, or also stuff like, you know, very different data points. And then if you look at what was in more right-leaning circles on social media, like a completely different narrative. And ultimately you have these people being like cognitively divided in a sense, like essentially living in separate realities. And because they just perceive these events so differently, right? So anyway, something to keep in mind as we go forward, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot more crazy stuff happening during this election season going forward.